Okay, I think we're going to begin.
Yes.
And I want to thank all of you for coming, but we're going to begin with my colleague,
Yes, that's
Mario
right.
Ruiz.
Yes, we would like to thank everybody here and for everybody who's registered for this. We know this is a large event and we have many exciting speakers and we're all very excited and looking forward to doing this. So I will briefly introduce Dr. Charnow. She'll give some remarks and then we'll proceed from there. It gives me great pleasure to introduce, if I can refer to her as Sally. I've known Sally the entirety of my career here at Hofstra. I won't say how long that is. Sally is a well-known presence in the department, both as chair and preceding her role as chair of the history department, but we're especially happy with her because of all the things that she's done on campus and especially for the pandemic. So kudos to the chair for pandemic Zooming and for chairing during a pandemic. Sally, I will give a brief bio of her. It is very brief, only for the interest of time. I could spend many more minutes here listing all of her accomplishments. But what I would like to say first is I'd like to emphasize both her interdisciplinary training. So she has interdisciplinary training in performance studies and history. That's shown up in her research and writing on issues related to cultural production, art, and politics, and minority subcultures in modern France and beyond. In terms of our publications, there are many. Again, for the purposes of time, I just want to curate them. So she's the author first of Theater, Politics, and Markets in Fin de Siècle, Paris, Staging Modernity. That was from Paul Brave in 2005. And her forthcoming book, Edmund Flegg and Jewish Minority Culture in 20th Century France. That's from Routledge in 2021. And her articles and reviews, I won't list them all, but they've appeared in a variety of forums, including Revising Dreyfus Art and Law, that's 2013, Radical History Review, the American Historical Review, French History, and Modern and Contemporary France, and H France. Again, that's just a small list. She's currently past president of the Society for French Historical Studies, after having served as co-president during the 2020 and 2021 academic year. No easy feat there in that academic year. So with great pleasure, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sally Charnow. Great to be here in person.
We're in the same room.
We are in the same room, a real physical room.
So it's my pleasure to welcome all of you from near and far to this book launch of Artistic Expressions and the Great War, 100 Years On. As you know, it's hosted by Hofstra University's Cultural Center, and it's been my great honor to work closely with the Cultural Center for the last many years. In that said, it's my heartfelt thanks to Melissa Conley, Atheline Collins, and Carol Mallison for their ongoing encouragement and support of my many projects. And just to tip my hat here, we're looking forward to working with them when we host the French Historical Studies Conference here in 2024. My special thanks also to Professor Cindy Rosenthal from the Drama and Dance Department, Mario Ruiz from the History Department, and also joining us from the History Department today are Stan Pugliese and Simon Doubleday. So just to set the stage a little, because we're not all on the same page of the Great War, but many of us know the Great War from 1914 to 1918 set in motion all of the subsequent violence of the 20th century. And when the fighting came to an end on November 11th in 1918, nearly 75 million military and civilian lives had been lost or transformed beyond all recognition, and millions more had been profoundly damaged by 4 years of global warfare. 4 empires had collapsed, the Ottoman, Habsburg, German, and Russian. And in the wake of post-war political turmoil, new nations emerged and fought to be recognized. Historians have been studying the war's origins, impact, and after effects since the guns fell silent in 1918. Dominant accounts of the war have largely focused on failed leadership and imperial ambitions, diplomatic blunders, soldiers, battles, and military strategies. Standard narratives outline the war of attrition on the Western Front and the invasion and occupation of large parts of Eastern Europe. Newer work is focusing on European colonial powers and how they use their colonies to recruit or coerce labor and supply raw materials. The imperial peripheries were also sites of intense combat themselves. and new technologies such as poison gas, zeppelins, airplanes, submarines, and large-scale artillery were deployed with devastating consequences for soldiers and civilians alike. The physical and psychological wounds these new weapons caused led to medical innovations such as blood transfusions, reconstructive plastic surgery, and treatments for shell shock. But it's beginning in the 1970s that cultural historians began writing a number of seminal studies about the war. The first, of course, is Paul Fusel's pioneering study, The Great War in Modern Memory, which underscored the dramatic transformative impact that the war had on British literature. And he argues that the First World War ushered in the modern era and revolutionized how we even see the world, how we consciously understand the world that we live in. His work was followed by Modris Eckstein's, his Rite of Spring, The Great War and the Birth of the Modern Age. And he also, in some sense, argued for the shattering of old, seemingly stable truths and that created a fertile ground for a broader acceptance of modernist critique. But he also adds to that modernist critique the rise of fascism and Nazism. Both Ecksteins and Fusel claim that the First World War was a psychological turning point, creating seismic shifts in human consciousness. Art historian Ken Silver, in his L'Esprit du Corps, The Art of the Parisian Avant-Garde in the First World War, actually comes in and complicates this modernist story put forward by Fusel and Ecksteins. He explores the impact of the war on French painters mostly, who were formerly abstract painters like Picasso and Leger and Matisse. And these painters responded to the horrors of war actually by trying to recuperate and represent the body as a whole and intact entity. It was more naturalist, more neoclassical in form. Also taking issue with a modernist interpretation of the European reaction to the Great War, of course, is the very well-known Jay Winter. And he reevaluated this whole notion of the modern in his work on collective remembrance, mourning, and commemoration in his book, Sites of Memory, Sites of Mourning, The Great War and European Cultural History. And he offers a comparative transnational perspective on post-war mourning and commemoration. And he's really looking at how these practices were both old and new. They were traditional and modern, conservative and iconoclastic. So coming to our book, the essays collected in this volume embody current concerns with gender, religion, minority nationalities, the Ottoman, Italian, and Eastern fronts. And they also complicate, and in some cases even trouble, the cultural paradigms established by these earlier historians, Fusel, Eckstein, Silver, and Winter. So just a little background, the book began with a conference under the same name that I organized here at Hofstra University in November 2018 to coincide with the centennial marking the end of the war. Scholars from around the world gathered to explore the ways in which artists contributed to wartime and post-war culture, both representing and shaping it, as well as the ways in which the war influenced artistic expression in a sense broadly conceived: literature, performing arts, visual arts, propaganda, architecture, and other mass-mediated forms. Some artists sought to renew and reestablish their place in the wartime and post-war climate, while others longed for a past that was largely imagined and irretrievable, and still others tried to break with the past entirely and forge a new modernist future. So there are four themes that sort of brought these essays together. And the first theme deals with what we're calling forgotten artists. Some of our authors explore the ways in which many figures that were incredibly famous at the time are no longer known to us. They have faded from our historical consciousness. Some have been obscured because they were more traditional or conventional in their style. And they sort of dropped out, if you will, of a notion of an art historical canon. But But by integrating these, what we might call patriotic artists, back into the historiography, this volume arrives at a more nuanced, complex, and expansive understandings of the responses to the outbreak of the war. It also helps to clarify the often puzzling question about why the war lasted so long, and as well as conflicted efforts of reconstruction that ensued in the aftermath. The second theme lifts up this sort of well-worn notion of, or myth of the war, that there was a universal, unified reaction to it as both shocking and a folly. The myth was often nurtured and perpetuated by post-World War II experiences of total war and Vietnam-era anti-militarism, and has masked the broad variation in the war's experience and interpretation. For some, their encounter with the war was satisfying. It opened up emotional opportunities previously unexplored. For others, there was an awe, even an awful majesty of combat, even when refusing to glorify it or find it enchanting. The third theme suggests that artistic expressions of the war were often based on the paradox that contain both continuity and rupture with the past. The best sort of kind of bringing this together is the notion of nostalgia. It's the most acute example of this paradox. But we see in these chapters often the juxtaposition of death and regeneration, loss and renewal, comedy and tragedy, symbolic memory, and efforts of rebirth. War as a crucible of innovation, coupled with a longing for the comfort of tradition. The last theme concerns post-war trauma, and that was shared, if you will, a kind of shared vulnerability that was experienced between civilian and combatant, and the role of mourning and commemoration in both healing from war, dislocation, and disfigurement, as well as unmasking the deeply ingrained social inequalities and failed state policies. So Carol, can we show the table of contents? I wanted everyone to see the table of contents. So we have 5 speakers today, but there were 14 essays in the text. Carol, are you there?
I hope she's there.
So maybe we can't.
I'm trying to share it.
Okay.
I don't know why it worked fine before.
I don't either. Anyway, I'll just say what the parts were as Carol's trying to share her screen. Part 1, the front, masculinity and heroic imagination. And the presenter today, Libby Murphy, her essay is part of that section. Part 2, civilians and the home front, gender, censorship, propaganda, and the avant-garde. Representing that section today is George Robb and Gizim Tongo. So we can see, so that's part 1, and now we can shift to the second page.
There we
Yay.
go. Yay.
Okay, part 2. Part 3, coping with war trauma, tradition, reconstruction, nostalgia. And Chandler Carter is sort of the person representing that section for us today. And part 4, memory, memorialization, and commemoration. And Anne Murray and Elizabeth Benjamin will both be speaking to those issues. So just to conclude, the following exploration of artistic expressions in the Great War offers striking convergences and dramatic differences across national boundaries, aesthetic decisions, and political motivations. We have gathered together many aspects of this complex history and put them into conversation with one another. The hope is that this volume is both accessible and provocative, lifting up aspects of war culture previously hidden from view. Together, these essays establish culture as an indispensable site of historical investigation and reveal the dynamic exchange between cultural forms and public life, shaped by political, economic, and military forces. So Carol, we can take the share screen down. Great.
Yeah.
And it's my pleasure to pass the baton to Cindy Rosenthal, who will be introducing our first two speakers. And I'm going to remind you now that please put all your questions in the chat and direct them to me. That would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. It's just an honor and a privilege to be able to collaborate again in any way with Sally Charnow. The conference was miraculous and inspiring, and the book is too, and it's great to see contributors in person again on the screen. I'm loving our being together, even if it is on Zoom. The person I'm first going to introduce to you is Libby Murphy. Libby is a professor of French at Georgia College. She's the author of The Art of Survival, France and the Great War Picaresque, and of articles and book chapters on the cultural history of the Great War, including the history of the French concept of le système dit, and the reception in France of the films of Charlie Chaplin. And the other person that I'm going to introduce is George Robb. George is a professor of history at Paterson University in New Jersey. He's the author of British Culture and the First World War, second edition, and he's currently researching a book on the American home front during World War I. So we'll start with you, Libby. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you, Sally, for this beautiful volume. Thank you to my fellow contributors, to everybody that put together this this event, and to all of you who've taken time out of your day to join us. Thank you. So let me try to share my screen. All good?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So my chapter is about cartoons published in the mass press during the Great War, and it kind of asks how we should approach cultural artifacts like these from 100 years ago. What kind of imaginative work did Great War cartoons perform for readers then? And what kind of imaginative work are we asking them to do for us now? And I looked at a ton of cartoons from the war years, but 3 soldier artists really stood out to me. 2 because they were so wildly popular at the time, and the 3rd because his work is seeing a kind of revival now. So first up is French cartoonist Francisque Poulbeau. He spent the war drawing scenes of these smart, sassy Montmartre street children playing at being soldiers and nurses. Oh no, okay, there you go. And one of the kind of tricks that he would do is make these visual analogies between these little boys playing at the home front and soldiers at the front. And I'm gonna dash through these. This is just to show you the kind of, well, visual analogy I'm talking about. And I know you won't have time to read all the captions, but maybe in the Q&A, there'll be time. So his drawings of children fraternizing with the poilus and making fun of Germans were ubiquitous. They were everywhere. They were in newspapers, magazines, postcards, and fundraising posters like this one. And they became icons of French childhood, of French soldier heroism, and of Frenchness in general, conceived of as this kind of plucky flair and insouciance, and a kind of irreverent resilience. So moving swiftly along from Britain to France, the second cartoon artist that I was really interested in is Bruce Bairnsfather. Okay, so we're moving from France to Britain and from kind of flair to phlegm as the national trait that's going to get showcased. So Bairnsfather's famous cartoon character is the middle-aged grump, William Busby, aka Old Bill. And Old Bill and his pals were wildly popular with soldiers and wildly unpopular with the officer class. And here we see Old Bill, this running joke that Bairnsfather had about Old Bill resembling a walrus or a sea lion. So Old Bill is a big lump of a man who, like the sea lion, can be ferocious when he needs to be, but prefers to be left alone to do his job the best he can. He's one of the old contemptibles, so the first men to the front who were from the kind of pre-war regular army. He's old enough to have seen a thing or two in his life, and he knows when to expend his energy and when not to bother. So this is arguably the most famous British cartoon of the war. The soldier on our right is an early incarnation of Old Bill, and he's scowling at this other soldier who's about to climb out of the shell hole they find themselves in. And the Old Bill character says to the other character, well, if you knows of a better hole, go to it. And this kind of encapsulates his attitude. If you want to waste your time and energy thinking there's a better place to be, then go for it, but I'm staying right here. So Old Bill's body, is weary, but his mind is sharp. And his sarcasm and his irony protect him. I'm sorry, there's a lag. I hit advance, and then there's a lag between when you get to see it. So so his sarcasm and irony kind of protect him psychologically from the horrors of war. And in terms of the horrors of war, are y'all seeing a slide of the young man from Cologne? Okay, excellent. So, you know, Bairnsfather will hint at the horrors of war, like this cartoon featuring, you know, an exploding dead body. But of course, it's a German body. And to show an Allied corpse in a mainstream cartoon would have been unthinkable at the time. So I'm saying that the problem that was facing Bairnsfather and really all writers and artists during the war years was how to reimagine the infantryman for the age of industrialized warfare in a way that could be recognizable and reassuring to both soldiers and civilians who had, very different experiences of the war. And I think that Bairnsfather and Poulbeau both succeeded, at least during the war years themselves. Afterwards, Poulbeau is kind of going to be rejected by veterans of the war. But are you seeing a very, very different image now from the one you just saw, or is it stuck? How about that? Excellent. Okay, so now we're moving to our third and final cartoonist, French soldier artist Gus Buffa, who suffered a horrific leg injury at the front and spent the rest of the war publishing drawings for the popular satirical magazine La Bayonnette. And there's really something shockingly raw and modern to me about Buffa's work. He has this unique visual style with this tough, sinewy line, and he has a tendency towards abstraction. His infantrymen are wiry, weary, everyday, everymen. They're holding themselves together, but showing serious signs of physical and emotional strain. And they often look a little bit sickly or shifty. There's a hint of pathology, both physical and psychological, about Buffa's soldiers that really set them apart from other infantrymen, cartoon infantrymen of the time. So this is a cover illustration for a special issue on funny guy entertainers, les loustiques. And this, this guy's forced grin and nicotine fix seem to be the only thing holding him back from kind of depression and despair. And this is kind of a harrowing self-portrait of the body in pain. This is a self-portrait of Buffa. Buffa himself was tall and lanky and had big protruding ears. So these are physical self-portraits, but also psychological self-portraits. So in this really not reassuring way that he has of describing and drawing the infantryman, he provides an intimate but oblique portrait of the soldier in distress. He gestures towards the trauma of war without going all the way. And I'll have to skip. Yeah. The others I can show in show and tell if we have time, but I just want to say that I think it's Buffa's focus on the brutality of war, not the brutality of the enemy, but brutality of war itself and what it does to the soldier, that explains why he's seeing a revival right now and Poulbeau and Old Bill aren't necessarily. At the same time, if you look at cartoons from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, you're going to see that same kind of old school, old bill, snarky gallows humor. So that too is alive and well, and it resurfaces over and over during conflicts in the 20th century and makes its way into the 21st century. So I think that modern war culture has a way of relying on kind of all three of these modes, right? The kind of cocky heroism that we saw with Pumbul, the kind of war-weary survivor that we see in Old Bill, and then the, trauma victim that we see in Gus Buffa. So that is all.
Rich, Libby.
Thank you.
Thank
So
you.
that's excellent. So we're going to move to George, and then we'll do a number more introductions. We sort of lump them together. So I'm going to spotlight you, George.
Exciting. All right. I don't have any images because I'm going to talk about literature and print censorship during the war, and about a group, an organization of American writers who called themselves, without any shame, the Vigilantes. The Vigilantes were a group of around 300 American writers who promoted patriotism during World War I, but were also involved in numerous censorship campaigns directed against immigrants, pacifists, or anyone they deemed insufficiently patriotic or pro-American. In fact, the Vigilantes' propaganda was far more strident and jingoist than that endorsed by the United States government's main propaganda arm, the Committee on Public Information. The CPI favored positive, upbeat propaganda that sold the war to Americans as a crusade for democracy and underplayed divisions in American society. The Vigilantes, on the other hand, pushed for the Americanization of immigrants, denounced enemy aliens and pacifists as vermin, and tried to suppress any publications with which they disagreed. I think the Vigilantes are interesting and significant because they offer a different story about censorship than told by most historians. Most accounts of censorship during World War I imagine artists and writers as the victims of thought control, organized by governments, rather than as censors themselves. The usual story of wartime censorship includes authorities banning anti-war books, suppressing pacifist and socialist periodicals, and even imprisoning writers accused of obstructing the war effort. Much less work has been done about the role of civil society, of schools, of churches, private clubs, and professional organizations that were involved in aiding and abetting government censorship. So the Vigilantes were founded by historian and Teddy Roosevelt biographer Herman Hagedorn in 1916, so a few months before the United States even entered World War II. And the Vigilantes consisted of several hundred of America's best known and most popular writers, people like Booth Tarkington, Hamlin Garden, Gertrude Atherton, Bliss Carman, Theodosia Garrison, Gelett Burgess, Edna Ferber, Charles Hanson Towne. Now, many of these writers are completely forgotten today, probably rightfully so. But a century ago, they were household names and huge bestsellers. The Vigilantes managed their own press syndicate, which supplied over 2,000 mass circulation newspapers with a steady stream of articles and poems free of charge. And I think that's what's part of their genius is, so they're these very famous popular American writers, and they're offering to newspapers all over the country free propaganda stories that they can publish every day. And so a lot of newspapers snap these things up. The Vigilantes did not pull their punches, vilifying and demonizing all opponents of the war. They characterized pacifists, socialists, and enemy aliens as, quote, different breeds of rats who needed to be exterminated. Playwright Edwin Arnold recommended that pacifists should be, quote, tried by court-martial and shot with their backs against a wall. They denounced certain college professors by name and contributed to Henry Dana being fired by Columbia University for his opposition to military conscription. The Vigilantes suspected that many recent immigrants to the United States were insufficiently patriotic, and they drew attention to obscure, small circulation German language newspapers in the Midwest. Right? Hardly anyone was reading these papers, but suddenly they're being denounced on the mainstream press by the Vigilantes, and this led to government raids on these papers and advertisers withdrawing their patronage. And many of these newspapers collapsed as a result of this. The Vigilantes' most famous act of censorship was its insistence that American public libraries remove from their shelves any books deemed unpatriotic. The originator of this plan was Marian Cathuy Smith, a poet from New Jersey. Of course, no one's heard of her today, but she had she had a certain reputation and following at the time. During a visit to her local library in East Orange, Smith was shocked to discover some books and pamphlets that were sympathetic to Germany. And these are things that probably had been published during the period of neutrality, when Americans were debating entry to the war and debating whether or not, the Germans or the British and French had the better position. So a lot of the stuff was still lingering in libraries, and so she was quite shocked to find it. And that led her to begin an inspection of a lot of public libraries in New Jersey. And all of the librarians who she spoke to were happy to remove these works. Right? She found these, what she considered these objectionable works, and she compiled a list of them. And she'd go around to local libraries and find them on the shelves. But most of the librarians were very accommodating. Said, "Oh my God, yeah, I'm sorry about that." And they were very happy to remove these things and to stash them away or just to throw them away. Until she came to Newark. And the Newark Public Library was one of the largest in the nation, and its director, John Cotton Dana, was famous in library and museum circles for his progressive ideas. Dana refused to remove any of the books from the Vigilantes' list of unpatriotic literature, telling Marian Smith, quote, "I came to the conclusion many years ago that liberty of thought is a very desirable thing for the world, and that liberty of thought can only be maintained by those who have free access to opinion." Now, while Dana's position might seem unobjectionable, even praiseworthy today, in the hyper-patriotic atmosphere of 1917, 1918, it was almost unique. Most American librarians were keen to prove their patriotism by pulling anything that was deemed critical of the war off their shelves. A number of libraries went so far as to remove all German language books or all books by German authors. In some cases, they even burned the books. The Newark controversy gave rise to additional inspections of libraries across the nation and to further removals of disloyal literature, quote unquote, disloyal literature. Librarians' eagerness to serve the needs of the state overrode any desire to defend the principles of intellectual freedom. In fact, no one in the library community in the United States stood up to Dana, and most of the newspapers who commented on this controversy were not sympathetic to Dana either. Okay, so it's an irony, I think a fairly well-known irony of the First World War, that a conflict America fought, quote, to make the world safe for democracy, frequently curtailed Americans' freedom of expression. Books were banned and burned, newspapers raided and suppressed. Today, it seems surprising that an organization like the Vigilantes, comprised of America's best known and most popular writers, would work so assiduously to censor the work of writers with whom they disagreed. Current writers' organizations like PEN are well known as defenders of First Amendment rights and as fierce critics of censorship, as is the American Library Association. Now, the Vigilantes pursued a very different course in 1917, 1918, arguing that free speech was never absolute, and during wartime should promote national resolve. That America's war aims might be open to criticism or needed to be publicly debated was not something that troubled the Vigilantes. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, George. Okay, I'm going to. Nice. Okay.
Now we're going to move on to another set of speakers. I'm going to introduce the first of them. So only one, but I'm thinking about the further set of presenters right there.
Right.
So this is a little bit of a shift. We are at 1:30. So I'd like to introduce Gizem Tongo. She's a part-time lecturer in the Department of Architecture in Leeds Technical University. She holds a doctorate in Oriental Studies from the University of Oxford, St. John's College, where she was a Lord Dilberton Scholar and later a Barakat postdoctoral fellow. Between September 2018 and 2021, she was a postdoctoral research fellow at the British Institute at Ankara. And she's worked on a variety of very interesting projects, one of which you will see today. I won't list all of the ones, the projects that she's worked on, but her most recent works involve curating and writing material for exhibitions, including co-creating an exhibition on a Turkish woman immigrant artist, Mehri, who lived from 1885 to 1954 at Salt Galata, Istanbul. And that currently she's working on a monograph entitled War, Art, and the End of the Ottoman Empire. So Gizem, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mario, for this generous introduction. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. And it's such a pleasure and honor to be with you all today. And thank you so much, Sally, for the brilliant organization that we had all together in November 2018. I would like to share my screen before I proceed. I hope you can see it okay.
Yes.
Wonderful. Oops. Okay, so before I start, I would like to thank Sally once again for this brilliant volume, which brings fresh insight to the debates on the cultural history of the First World War from a transnational perspective. The title of my chapter is Militarization and Mobilization of the Ottoman Art World During World War I, an Internal Kulturkampf. In my chapter, I explore the development of state and civil society patronage in the mobilization of the Ottoman art world during the First World War. My three major questions were: how did the war affect the art world, art institutions, and the art market in the Ottoman Empire? To what extent could artists benefit economically and artistically from the culture of war? And to what extent did they suffer from the political, practical, and social difficulties the war precipitated? The Ottomans entered the war on the side of the Central Powers in October 1914 and fought alongside Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria on 9 different fronts. In recent years, many excellent studies have focused on economic, military, political, and social history of the Ottoman Empire during the war years. Most of the scholarship on Ottoman wartime art and culture, however, has revolved around the issue of propaganda. When the state is positioned as the main protagonist in the story of wartime culture, one can certainly find enough archival evidence for top-down jingoistic cultural policies. But such a state-centric focus obscures alternative views of the war. In fact, despite the recent and very impressive work about the Ottoman wartime experience, what is still largely missing is how artists as real people experience the war. My chapter aims to bring a human dimension to this story beyond narratives of propaganda. I argued that during the course of the First World War, the cultural milieu transformed from a pluralistic and cosmopolitan entity into a political faction in which an internal Kulturkampf over the role of the arts shaped Ottoman culture and artists' duty towards society. I borrowed the term Kulturkampf, culture struggle, to understand the conflict between the state and civil society in the art world. The cultural historian J. Winter uses the concept to show how in most belligerent countries, certain art modes and styles were considered to be tainted by affiliation with enemy culture. In Britain, for instance, Beethoven was soon replaced by English composers. In France, Cubism and Orientalism were criticized as Germanic. Here is an illustration by a French artist who created a series of Cubist portraits of the Germans. George also in his chapter and today talk about the situation in American libraries. In the Ottoman Empire, however, the war raised a cultural dilemma. Here, the separation of our side from theirs took a very different course from that in other belligerent countries. The Ottoman Empire saw the mobilization of its national culture in the cause of a civilization that was synonymous with European civilization. But there was an internal conflict over cultural values between militaristic agendas, often nourished by Turkish nationalism, and more cosmopolitan and civic-minded visions. In my chapter, I compare state-sponsored culture initiatives with the more civic-minded ones. For instance, it was during the war that an art academy of fine arts for women was founded in Istanbul, which in normal times could have easily been rejected in a concession to conservative sentiment. Furthermore, the culture of war enabled some Ottoman artists to achieve a broader appeal in popular culture via patriotic postcards and newspapers illustrations. Some Muslim Ottoman artists, especially those with a military painting education, like Hüseyin Hüsnü and Mehmet Ruhi, as we see here, also benefited from state sponsorship. However, direct state control also decreased spaces and opportunities for non-Muslim Ottoman artists in the cultural sphere. As non-allied foreigners, for instance, the Academy of Fine Arts Italian instructors, who had contributed to the artistic life of the city since the late 19th century, were all subject to security concerns and forced to retire in 1915. Furthermore, in 1917, when the War Ministry commissioned a group of modern Ottoman painters to create war-related works for an exhibition in the Allied capitals, there was not a single Ottoman Armenian or Greek artists among them. In contrast to direct state sponsorship, there was also a community of more civic-minded Ottoman intellectuals and artists whose aim was to assure Istanbul's artistic vitality and who were temporarily able to open up less propagandistic and exclusivist artistic spaces. Two major art exhibitions that took place in Istanbul in 1916 and 1917, for instance, gave space to many non-war related works and to various non-Muslim Ottoman artists, like the young Ottoman Greek woman painter on the left, you see Eleni Iliadis. Yet the Ottoman art world between 1914 and 1918 was also marked by deep political and social changes. While those already outlined could be understood as progressive, others curtailed the development of Ottoman cultural life or were regressive in the extreme. Against all the efforts by civil society, many Ottoman artists found their artistic lives limited and disrupted. For instance, the young Ottoman artists who were continuing their long-awaited art training at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris had to leave the city behind when the war started. Also, the Academy of Fine Arts in Istanbul lost many talented art students who were soon in uniforms. It's a photograph of a young architecture student we see on one of the fronts. The artistic community who suffered most from the war was certainly the Ottoman Armenians. Due to the large-scale persecutions of the Ottoman Armenians from April 1915 onwards, events that constituted the Armenian genocide, many Ottoman Armenians' artistic lives were utterly destroyed. The Armenian painter Panos Terlemezyan is a case in point. Having received his art training first in St. Petersburg and later in Paris at the Académie Julienne, Terlemezyan was perhaps one of the most recognized painters of the Istanbul art world before the war started. For instance, in 1913, he represented the Ottoman Empire at the International Munich exhibition. During the war, however, he barely survived the genocide, had to leave his prolific artistic life behind, and live as an exile until the end of the conflict. To conclude, I can say that during the First World War, the Ottoman art world witnessed another battle on the home front, as it was caught between top-down militaristic agendas and more civic-minded cosmopolitan initiatives. After the fall of the empire in 1918, however, the long-standing cosmopolitanism of the Ottoman art world never really recovered from the shocks it received during the war years. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That was great.
Yeah.
That was a lovely presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So,
All right, so I have the pleasure of introducing three more contributors. First is Chandler Carter, my colleague, professor of music here at Hofstra University and the author of The Last Opera, The Rake's Progress in the Life of Stravinsky and Sung Drama. A scholar of opera and the music of Stravinsky, Carter is also a respected composer. His most recent work, This Little Light of Mine, based on the life of civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer, has been commissioned by the Opera for All Voices Consortium, and as far as I understand, has actually premiered in some form this past May 2021. Very exciting. I'm also introducing Anne Murray. Anne gained her PhD at University College Cork in 2017. Her research focuses on the impact of war in visual culture since 1914, specifically the relationships between art, war, politics, and memorialization. Overall, her work insists on the centrality of art as a nexus of thought, linking war, politics, and society. She's published articles, book chapters, and 2 edited collections, and will publish a monograph on Otto Dix's war art in 2022. Finally, Elizabeth. I'm getting my notes. We're almost there. Elizabeth Benjamin is a lecturer in French at Coventry University. Her research interests intersect visual culture, aesthetics, and cultural memory with a particular interest in the early 20th century. Her current work explores the role of memorialization in the formation of national identity, analyzed through art, literature, and culture. She's the author of Dada and Existentialism, the Authenticity of Ambiguity. So we'll start with Chandler. Thank you, Chandler.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you so much also, Sally, for the conference, the book, and everything. So let me try to move to presenter view. Okay. So my the idea for my paper came actually from a class I was teaching at Hofstra in my first year, 25 years ago. I was lecturing on Alban Berg's opera Wozzeck, and Wozzeck is really a seminal work of modernist opera. It's really one of the defining works. It's the war. It combines. It was written during the war. The subject itself is not set during World War I, but it is extremely easy to translate it into that time. The play was actually written by Georg Büchner back in 1836. It was unfinished and he died, he was very young and died soon thereafter. And it was thought to be lost. They found it though, and the playwright finished it. And that rescued version was finally staged for the first time in 1914. So that's the play called Wojciech. Berg saw that play and immediately wanted to make an opera out of it. The war quickly diverted his project. In fact, as you can see here in this picture, was drafted, served in the army. And that experience also made him even more committed to the character. In fact, he identified with the character of Wozzeck, who was a victim of, really a victim of everything about the modern world. Technology, progress, and of course, militarization. So I'm presenting this piece, and I'll just jump to the, it's an atonal expressionist work. It's intense, and I'm playing a passage for them where the main character, spoiler alert, drowns himself. He's lost his mind, has murdered his common law wife, and is now supposedly going to find the knife to throw it into the water, but in fact drowns himself. So here's what he sees. He sees the moon rise and sings to it.
Aber der Mond verrät mich. Der Mond ist blutig. Will denn die ganze Welt es ausplaudern?
Okay, so what was my, so on the back row, a student, a jazz saxophone player, who's now the director of the Hofstra Jazz Band. So he went on to do very good things. He's a very curious student, and I could see on the look on his face, he looked to the side glance to another student, And he was hearing something, and as soon as I saw that he recognized something, I myself heard it for the first time. And that is this. I'll play it again for you, but now you can see the music. The harp is outlining what we would now think of as a blues scale.
Aber der Mond verrät mich. Der Mond ist blutig. Will denn die ganze Welt es ausplaudern?
So that stuck in the back of my mind, and many, many years later, I decided to pursue this idea. And I'm a trained music theorist. I'm also a composer. I've also been trained like a music historian in some ways. And there's at least two different ways you could dig into this question. And of course, the question of my paper is, has Wozzeck got the blues? So one is an historical question. So could Berg have heard this music? W.C. Handy had published his St. Louis Blues in 1914. Did Berg know that music? He might have heard it. It was in fact sounding in France all toward the end of the war. The American, from 1917, 1918, the Harlem Hellfighters had a famous band led by an already well-known and successful conductor, James Reese Europe. And he founded the Harlem Hellfighters band, and they performed they were playing this on the front in French cities and for French citizens in 1918 and 1919. So it's possible he could have heard it. He wouldn't have, of course, heard this music in Vienna, but it was recorded on the Cathuy label in 1919. So Berg was writing the end of his opera in that scene in 1921. So that's possible. So that's one way of looking at it as a music historian. Another way to look at it is as a music theorist, look at it in terms of structure. So what is the blues scale? What was Berg thinking maybe, or how does this relate to the structure of the opera? So the blues scale was, in fact, not really a thing in 1919. The blues was a thing, but people didn't necessarily think of it as a scale. You can take the notes out of W.C. Handy's St. Louis Blues and pull out a blues scale, but his Memphis Blues, which was 1912, there's more to it than that. So it's not till a generation later in the 1930s and 40s that people even think of such a thing. Another possibility for Berg is, was he interested in jazz and the blues? Well, the answer is he certainly would be. And he was interested in popular music. He used popular music in Wozzeck, but it was more like an expressionist parody of rag, more than what we would think of as the blues. And he would later go on and incorporate jazz into later works in the 1920s. So, but whether he did so in 1921, the answer is probably no. So from a music theorist and a music historian standpoint, the question, has Wozzeck got the blues, is probably not like we would think of it. But it struck me that there's a larger question involved here, because my student certainly knew the blues, and this is 1997, so he was thinking in terms of the blues. And when he hears this music, the blues immediately jumps to mind. And that counts for something. The way we receive music, the way we receive any form of art, transforms the art. So, and the character of Wozzeck certainly belongs to the same world of the feeling of oppression, the world's weight, that was coming down on everyone during this time, it struck me it's not entirely a coincidence that the blues is emerging out of the American rural musical experience of the American South in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and that Europe is also encountering this incredible collapse during the time of the Great War. So from that standpoint, I'd say, yes, hell yeah, Wojciech has the blues, but from a strict structural standpoint, perhaps not. So.
Thank you, Chandler. We're going to move along to Anne Murray. Thank you so much.
There we go.
Okay, I'm just looking to share my screen. Okay, I don't seem to be able to share it, Sally. It's not working like earlier. A second.
You shared it before.
I know, yeah, I know. I'm not sure. 1 second.
I think you have to go to
Oh yeah, I have it now, Sally. I have it now, yeah. Okay. Okay, so can you see the slides now? Can you see them there?
They're coming.
We think
Okay.
that
Yes,
There
they
it
have
is,
them.
yes.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Okay. Okay, well, oh dear, sorry about that. Okay, 1 second. Right. Okay. Okay, so my paper focused on a painting by Otto Dix, a German painter who spent 38 months on the World War I battlefields. So he was a soldier and probably was, and still is remembered as probably the most, I suppose, persistent memoriographer, if you like, of the war, at least visually. This painting was exhibited for the first time in Dresden in 1928, and on the back of several other major paintings by the artist, which had caused considerable controversy throughout the 20s. So I'm thinking in particular of these. So this first painting here, the card players, which some of you might know, I actually just saw this last week. I was in Berlin last week and just saw it in the flesh again. And I can tell you that it's far more affecting than it would ever be in this slide. It's incredibly effective. It's absolutely devastating. But the picture next to it there, the trench, this is probably, I think Alfred Barr of the Museum of Modern Art in New York called this probably the most controversial painting of the 1920s, the trench, which of course has been missing since 1939. And this, of course, was exhibited in Cologne in December 1923 and caused uproar well into the summer of 1924 when it was exhibited again at the Prussian Academy of Art because of its very visceral, damning, devastating representation of dead soldiers in a World War I trench. And it is it's a remarkable picture. It's about 2 meters square, I think. So it would have made a huge impact. And of course, in 1924, he also released his series of 50 intaglio prints called The War. And these also caused a furore when they were exhibited with Cathuy Kollwitz's set of 7 woodcuts in the very first anti-war museum set up by Ernst Friedrich in Berlin. In 1924. So he was well known. He was famous, maybe infamous to some, as a painter of the war. And certainly, I think he's arguably the most confrontational painter of the war's effects during and after the conflict. 1 second there, I'm missing a slide somewhere. I'll just go back to Metropolis for a moment. So the essay focused, the book chapter focused on the exhibition of this painting in Dresden in 1928 at an exhibition called Saxon Art of Our Time. And of course, by this time, Dix was also professor of painting at the Dresden Academy of Arts and had a very lively and busy studio of young artists under his wing. And this picture is remarkable for the fact that, it's exhibited 10 years after the war. There's again a lot of debates surrounding the impact of the war for Germany. They're past the worst of the crisis, the economic crisis that happened after the war. But the idea of the lost war, I would say probably, as I think Richard Bessel did in that remarkable book on Germany after World War I, that Germany never really made that transition from a post-war society to a society of peace. There was always a very delicate peace in Germany. And that is possibly why Dix's paintings, they've been shown to a very sensitized audience, and perhaps beyond Germany may have not had the impact that they had there. And certainly the trench didn't have the same impact in Zurich when it was exhibited there in 1929 as compared to its exhibition in 1923 and 24 in Germany. So this painting, what is so controversial about it, I suppose at first glance, it doesn't have the same confrontational content as the trench. But if you look closely, you'll see that the central panel, which shows revelers, I suppose, in a nightclub, in a big city nightclub, all very well dressed and dancing. Apparently the Charleston, although look a bit stiff on the dance floor to me. These figures look quite bizarre, like they're in a trance or something, but very well dressed and enjoying everything that life has to offer. Whereas if you look to the sides, the wing panels, you see that literally society's outcasts have been sidelined, literally put to the side in the wing panels. So on either side, you'll see that they have a kind of a similarity. You see veterans of the war in both panels. There's two in the left panel, one who is an amputee. The other one seems to be passed out, either drunk or whatever, but there seems to be something spewing out of his mouth. And what appears to be a string of prostitutes in this kind of back lane, possibly at the back of the club that's been shown at the center. On the right-hand side, you see these kind of slightly better dressed, maybe more kind of well-off or looking prostitutes. One which seems to have been reduced to a kind of a female genitalia. I don't think that's accidental, this is Dix after all. But at the bottom here, you see this kind of hapless veteran, double amputee. And if you can see, I think another slide, you can see a little better. Can you see here? You can see that possibly he's blind as well here on the right. You can see that he's probably blind. And he seems to be saluting to the women who are passing him, maybe some kind of hallucination or something. Or maybe that to suggest his former respect that he held as a soldier of the German army. But you can see here that, this central panel is very bright, and these two here kind of recede a little bit. They're a little bit darker. And I don't think that's accidental either. It's just that he wants to show us that these figures have been literally sidelined in society, forgotten about, even though these are the figures who have lost the most because of the war. The soldiers, of course, have lost their physical and mental health. And the women, many of these women, not all, of course, but some of them certainly were forced into prostitution because they'd lost the main breadwinner in the family, and they couldn't find any other work and were forced onto the streets. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this, and is something maybe that has been overlooked in other analyses of the painting, but for me is very striking, is the fact that this figure here has Dix's features. Okay, now Dix wasn't maimed by the war, he wasn't injured, but it's very interesting that he has his back turned to us and he has Dix's features. And this is very interesting in the context of German art, because some of you might be aware of Caspar David Friedrich's painting Wanderer Above the Sea of Mist, where you see this man with his back turned to us as he looks at the landscape. And this is a very typical device in German painting. It's called the Rückenfigur, which literally means a figure with his or her back turned to us, so that we assume they're guys in the picture and see what they are seeing. So I find this really important. This is really important to me. And it's just after, I don't know, something maybe that was right in my face and didn't see, and it hadn't been mentioned anywhere else. So I said, hang on a minute, this is a very common device in Germanic painting, this idea of leading the viewer in through the Rückenfigur. And it's also quite interesting that generally the Rückenfigur is at the center, but here the Rückenfigur is at the side. And so I think that Dix is really attempting to get us to walk in the veteran's shoes, to get us to see the world in 1928 from the veterans' perspective and just see that things are really not any better off. This is the hero. This is the life of the hero. This is where all the medals and this is what they mean now, which is not very much. And I think that's quite, I think this is a very important aspect of the painting. Sorry there, I seem to have been missing a slide. We need to look at the context of the picture a little bit as well, in that what is surrounding Dix's art, and that say of artists like George Grosz, who's also a very interesting painter and draftsman. But popular art looked quite different. Popular art looked like this. This is what a lot of people saw, and many volumes of commemorative volumes, and say the popular Rijksarchiv, which is published, I think about rate of 1 or 2 volumes a year throughout the 1920s. And you will see this kind of cleansed version of war on the Western Front. You don't really see the dirty, bloody, disgusting, stinking hell that it was. I find this one quite interesting. This one was called Behind Enemy Lines. That's the title of this work here. And I'm sure it didn't really look like that at all. But this is what you see. And this kind of idea of the steely warrior, and there was that idea, I suppose, in Germany, having lost the war, that they wanted something to be proud of. They wanted to still feel proud to be Germans. And I suppose Dix's pictures weren't really, weren't giving them that. It was telling them, this is what it looks like. This is what the war looks like. It doesn't look anything like you want to believe it looks like. And this is where it got us, And so you also have a very politicized environment in 1928 when this painting is first exhibited. You see that various political parties are using visual culture to engage people with the memory of the war in different ways and for political gain. And you can see here in this magazine, the Vara Jacob by the Social Democrats, showing you like this is, kids start out playing with toys and then they become soldiers, and here's where it gets them, And of course, the National Socialist poster here, or else they died in vain, this is what did they die for if we don't do something about it? So very different, this creeping extreme right-wing element is already well underway in 1928. And this is possibly the reason why Dix is returning to the subject of the war again after a few years of not really looking at it. In Dresden as well, you have a very politicized environment and kind of conscious of the time. So somebody tell me when I'm nearly out of time, so a little bit worried I'll go over. You have a very heavily politicized environment where you have a lot of extreme right-wing and left-wing groups, which is quite bizarre for arts. It's really politicized. And this painting here on the left just gives you an idea of a Dresden artist's work, the extreme right. You can see the very different message here by Willy Waldapfel. Now, I couldn't get a more closer to 1928 than that, because many of these works have been missing or lost or destroyed. And this, of course, is only available in reproduction. The painting is not, we don't know where it is anymore. But you can see the very different spirit. This is really what these extreme right-wing artists are producing. This idea of the German army moving forward, undefeated in the field, no matter what, So Dix is doing this, and trying to remind people of what the war actually did mean, it was exhibited, as I said, it was exhibited at this major exhibition in Dresden in 1928 and got mixed reviews for that reason, that you have this kind of highly polarizing political and cultural environment. And of course, you have this figure, Bettina Faisal Romader, who you may never have heard of because she's been kind of written out of a lot of critical analyses of Weimar Germany, simply because maybe it's considered to be a sort of pseudo-history, that these Volkish art reviewers who are Nazis or whatever have been written out, so that we just ignore them, they're not important. But actually, I think they're very important in the sense that they kind of show you how the art functioned in its own context, how the National Socialists found this work.
And we need to wrap it up, okay?
Okay, sorry. I'm just the problem is I couldn't see my notes when I put on the screen, so I had to just do it off script, so I'm really sorry about that. I think I've got most of the message there anyway. I think I can stop, and if anyone has any further questions about it, I can answer those. Sorry for going over. Thank you very much.
No worries, great, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Elizabeth, you're up. Elizabeth Benjamin.
Yeah, but we need to get her to stop sharing screen.
There she goes.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect. Okay, Elizabeth, I'm going to,
All good.
Yeah, yeah, very good.
Yeah.
Okay, so welcome to Coventry. Coventry is actually famous for World War II, so maybe I should change professions. My chapter in Sally's fantastic book was the French art of remembering representations of World War I from the contemporary to the contemporaneous. My chapter looks at the questions of how to commemorate World War I and its memory at its centenary, looking at the evolving approaches to conflict and its developing memoryscape, and how this relates to developments in memory and history, particularly cultural memory studies, and collective consciousness and individual memory identity constructs. And I looked at this through the theory of cultural memory, so a sort of lens on the artifacts, and in application to verbo-visual cultural artifacts. And because I'm in French and Francophone studies, my example is the Francophone world, and specifically France here. So at the centenary of World War I started to become interested in the ways in which the international conflicts had started to be filtered into national memoryscapes with this increasing digitalization through what I like to call websites of memory, just unashamedly modeling myself on Pianora there. And I was interested in the way that the artifacts are curated and also act as curators of memory through those contemporaneous to World War I, right through to the present. So today I'm giving you a quick whistle-stop tour. I'll try and be as quick as possible, and some of my conclusions that I drew in the chapter. So I started with the contemporary memory of World War I, looking at a film by Coppol called Cécile Le Feu, which looks at PTSD and also treatment of colonial subjects. The Francophone comic Les Godillots by Olivier Marco, a sort of subjective interpretation through this comics form. The photography project by Jean Richardot, which is called Ça fait partie du paysage, where he takes photos of sites of World War I that have been integrated into the contemporary landscape. This is a bed and breakfast here with a trench in the back garden. And then Liliane Bouquet's novel Avant le silence des forêts, which is, it's been criticized for genericizing on war, but actually it gives a really good intro into individual perspectives on it. And then finally, L'Ensemble Calliope, which has been described as the musical thread of history and performs wartime music to give a different approach to the trope of the soldier. The usefulness then of this sort of copy of the past comes from the way in which it updates memory for a contemporary public, which today obviously is one of secondary memory, it's beyond lived memory. And it also addresses formerly neglected aspects of World War I, so the discussion of colonial subjects, the updated attitudes towards trauma, including the changing terminology surrounding it, and then the opening up of the idea of war as highlighting societal flaws and anxieties. And so contemporary representation of this period updates and enhances the original experience, but it potentially also softens it through an increased aesthetic interpretation thereof. And then secondly, I looked at anthologization of World War I, so looking at anthologies and collections. This type of representation is quite interesting because it bridges the gap between the contemporary and the contemporaneous through today's cultural products and the primary sources from the time. So firstly, I looked at the 2017 Exposition Femmes exhibition at the Musée de la Grande Guerre, which looks at the role of women and trying to update that. Then the online collection, it's a collection of collections of photos and paintings and analyses as well, called Représenter les ravages de la guerre, so looking at all the ways in which war damage was carried out but also represented. And then looked at Les Musiciens de la Grande Guerre, which is a CD anthology. A lot of it is done by the Ensemble Calliope as well. So again, bringing out this, changing the trope of the soldier and looking at the creative role of soldier composers. And then finally looking at Apocalypse en Belgique, which is a new book, relatively new at this point, on accounts from Belgium, which is often a place that's just considered no man's land, but this is bringing it out in its own right. So these examples showed then the politics of the curation of memory, including those whose role in conflict is often downplayed, And anthologies and curations form an important link between the past and the present, as I've mentioned before. So they copy the past by literally reproducing it, but they also change its context through curating it alongside other artifacts. And then finally, I looked at primary or contemporaneous examples. So firstly, at the typographical masterpieces of Apollinaire, so his calligramme, and then also the poetry of Sandra through La Guerre au Luxembourg, which compares the play of children to actual warfare, as Anne mentioned just now. And then looking at some music, I looked at Noël des enfants qui n'ont plus de maison, which is talking about children's experience and very blamey on the Germans that caused these problems. And then in very strong contrast, Dédé's work in Vasco Pas, which is very patriotic, but we today can see it as an indictment of war through our contemporary interpretation of it. And then finally, looking then at literature, I looked at Les Mémoires d'un rat by Chienne, and then Henri Barbu's Le Feu, looking at the ways in which the war can be fictionalized and written about in literature in this way. So what I discovered through analysis of these artifacts was that while contemporaneous accounts might not shy away from denouncing the horrors of war, as we can see here, as well as raising issues of whether it's okay to fictionalize such experiences, they do so in a context of insufficient awareness of their real long-term effects, which is something that we then bring to it later on. So then in terms of our discussion of memory, remembrance, and historicization, we see a shift in patterns of identity definition in relation to conflict. So what should we do with all this? And the main conclusions that I drew from my chapter were that memory has become individual, but this doesn't mean that it should become individualist. It's important to emphasize diverse individual perspectives on memory, and given the great potential for multifaceted approaches to responses to atrocities and nuanced cultural policy therearound. So cultural policy is something I'd like to work on next. So as long as this emphasis doesn't fall back on the liberal individual self and the populist nationalism that we've been seeing a rise of recently. So my chapter showed the need to use this type of memory, but use it constructively, providing we think of the individual not in isolation, but in relational terms, and situate memories in their broader socio-political context. And then finally, it showed that through leaning on the notion of situated knowledges, we can build more diverse and inclusive collective memories through looking at these multiple individual perspectives together, such as in this volume. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We do have some minutes for questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, 13.
Yeah. So I am actually going to add us, let's see, no. I'm gonna, anyway, there are some questions have come into the chat, and sorry, the first one actually, wasn't the first, it was the second. This is sort of from Ellen Garvey, and she's asking, she says the comically exploding German corpse, this is for Libby, as in Bruce Bairnsfather's image in There Was a Young Man of Cologne, might owe something to 19th century US racist cartoonist E.W. Kimball, whose Coon alphabet, let's see, where is it? I'm not, sorry. Yeah, I'm going the wrong way. Whose Coon alphabet featured one black child after another being exploded or otherwise destroyed. And so she asked Libby if you have any thoughts on any hint at a tradition of celebrating and making light of the destruction of the quote unquote other.
I think that's an amazing example, and it makes me think of the ways I've been uncomfortable with Paul Fussel's idea of, you know, the Great War as a moment of lost innocence, because that presupposes that there wasn't a lot of horror in the 19th century. So that's something I'd be really interested in looking into. And I was, the only other thing I'd say, because I didn't get to show the image of a non-comical version of German dead bodies that was deployed by Gus Buffa, was a way, I think, to hint at, you know, yes, this is a German soldier, but we have to imagine that this could have been a French soldier. He places that image at Verdun, where there were tons of French casualties as well as German. But thank you so much for that insight.
And we also have a question from my colleague Simon Doubleday for Gizem. And his question is your sense that there was a similar internal struggle between nationalist and cosmopolitan artistic visions in other societies? Or do you think that what you were talking about was distinct in the Ottoman case? And I'm going to tag another question along with that, although it's not totally related. But you talk about the Armenians having suffered. I have a student actually working on Jews in the Ottoman Empire right now, and I'm wondering if there were Jewish artists that how they might have fared during the culture comp.
Oh, thank you. Wonderful question. So, I mean, I think we are, we're an international group, so I would love to ask this, maybe raise this question to everybody, but in my sensation is that the Ottoman Empire was quite unique to have an internal culture camp during the First World War. But I'm happy to raise this question to other speakers if they think that was the other case. Because when the culture camp, the culture struggle over arts, as I said in my paper, was against the enemy culture in other countries. As I say, Beethoven was banned in the UK, in Britain, or certain art forms like Orientalism or Cubism were regarded as the enemy's art forms. But in the Ottoman Empire, as an empire which admired European civilization, especially France, even though they were fighting against France, that was not the case. I mean, Russian literature continued to be translated. French literature continued to be translated. When Rodin died, many articles were written to commemorate the French sculptor. But the internal conflict, which kind of put the militaristic and the propagandistic side, also together with Turkism, against the cosmopolitan and more civic-minded side, was a more internal culture camp. And I think it was quite unique to the Ottoman Empire, but I'm happy to discuss it with others. And for Jewish artists, I would say the Betzalel school, if Jerusalem was part of the Ottoman Empire until 1917, and there was this fine art school opened by the Ottoman Jewish artists as part of the Betzalel school in Jerusalem. I think I'm also, I hope one person or one scholar in the future will write about the Betzalel school relationship to the First World War. But my artists so far, I have not come across any Jewish painters in Istanbul, and I've been in touch with various scholars who work on Jewish culture, but I'm also interested in if anybody would say anything about the Betzalel school in Jerusalem. I hope this answered your questions.
Yeah, thank you. There was another question from Simon.
Yes, and it was a question about irony, whether some of you have been picking up in the images that we're seeing.
He's talking about, he's asking, he said, and this is referencing Libby, your work, he says, interesting comment about British irony and sarcasm as rhetorical devices, ensuring protection from the horror of war. And the question is this new to the Great War, or was it also tangible in prior British conflicts in terms of the use of irony? Whether you have any thoughts on that, but you need to unmute.
For that question, I'm going to have to defer to people who know the British context better than I do. But I love that question, and I love the idea of going back even further and looking for, the raw material that this stuff grew out of.
Thanks. You have a question?
I do. For another question. I'm particularly fascinated by your presentation because I work on late Ottoman period, but from the Egyptian perspective. So I guess my more elementary question to you is, when you're speaking about the Ottoman art world, to what extent is this an Istanbul-based world? Because I'm wondering, the reach of art, of course, was across the provinces of the Ottoman Empire. But in the examples you're giving, what I understood from your presentation, they were primarily painting-based. And I was actually looking at photography in Egypt during World War I. So for that reason, I'm just wondering, to what extent, when you say an Ottoman art world, do you mean an Istanbul world?
That's an excellent question. I think we mostly focus on Istanbul, but in my other research, I also try to include the, I don't want to say the periphery, but the other parts of the empire. And not Egypt. I don't work on Egypt, but try to include, for instance, the art world in Izmir, the art world in Van. So today's Turkey's map. But I think, what I tried to say Istanbul definitely was the center, the cultural city of the Ottoman Empire during that time. And I think in a way it was the most active during the First World War. I'm not saying other things didn't happen, like Izmir, there were exhibitions, there were concerts, operas that was happening. But I think I take it as a very good criticism. When we say Ottoman art, we should look at other parts as well. And maybe you would like to add something on that, Mario, about Egyptian, maybe photographers during the First World War or visual artists in general.
Well, in general, I like your project a lot, and I think more people need to be doing it. And that's why I think your monograph will be exciting when it comes out, because as you well know, there's nobody else that I know of that's even working on the subject that you're working on or asking the questions that you're asking. So one needs to appreciate what is being done, which is the work that you're doing. So it's great. It's just something as a future item to add on our future as part of our
Thank you.
So I had a question for Anne. First of all, I'm still sort of reeling from the graphic, as you say, visceral power of the images that you were showing of Otto Dix's. It's just, they're extraordinary. But you also bring up something, or you mentioned something about, it has to be, the female genitalia, that this is to be expected with Dix, that this is something that Dix, that he, would be depicting. And I was actually curious about that. I mean, I'm wondering, in your monograph, do you focus at all on where and how he shows images of women? And is it primarily, prostitutes, or is there any variety of depictions that you talk about or you frame in some way in your work?
That's a very good question. Can you hear me actually? I'm not sure I'm being heard.
Absolutely, we hear you.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. Yeah, the monograph focuses mainly on the war art, but of course the imagery of women comes into it, I suppose, a little sideways. It's not centered really about the memory of the war in a more direct way. But when I say Dix, it's to be expected of Dix. He was, are you familiar with his work at all? Are you familiar with his painting?
What I see, there are, his work is displayed at Museum of Modern Art. It's also at the Met. So what I've seen up front in my own life has always been powerful in my memory, but I'm not so familiar. I'm feeling much more interest, and I'd like to follow this up thanks to you.
There's a painting, he got into a lot of trouble in 1922 with a painting called Girl in a Mirror. I'd ask you to look that one up.
Okay.
You search for a Girl in a Mirror. He was brought to court. He got into a lot of trouble over that one because he showed an aging female figure from looking at herself in a mirror, bending over. Very, very, I've never seen him do this. Actually, it's an interesting thing that he never seems to shred the male body in the way he does the female body. It's absolutely shocking. It's like he's trying to, I don't know, it's like to show the most grotesque, the most, every aspect he can drag out of the female form that does not flatter it in any manner at all. It's absolutely shocking. It shows the genitalia, even aging genitalia, if that's imaginable. The breasts sagging, all this. It's really, really shocking. And one would ask, I guess, when you look at the trajectory of his work, that even though he shows the soldiers decaying and dying in the trenches, they're not made to look as, they're not objects of scorn. You look at these women and you can see that there's an eye on them that just wants them to, he just seems to uglify them as much as possible.
Yeah.
There's another painting called Three Women, Drei Weiber. It's a kind of a strange word for women in Germany. It's not called Drei Frauen, it's always Drei Weiber, W-E-I-B-E-R. And I think when I saw this for the first time about 10 years ago in the flesh, I was absolutely horrified, because it's one of the women is bending over and it's almost as if she's she looks like a female dog which has just given birth to 6 or 7 puppies, and it's just the body. It's absolutely shocking. And another woman, then she's standing on the left, and her genitalia are kind of sticking right out at eye level, and it's just every little sinew and vein, and the surface of the skin seems to have a layer of dirt on it, whatever way he's painted it. It's absolutely horrific. I'm not sure why he seems to have almost attacked the female body in this way, but it is an interesting question, because when you look at the male body and all these paintings of the veterans, even though they're shown broken, their bodies are broken and destroyed, it's never done in a way that seems to attack them, to make them as grotesque as possible. It seems to be more about showing what they suffered rather than, you know, these. I mean, it's hard to kind of see these paintings of women as just paintings of women, or of aging women, or whatever, or women who have showing the effects of prostitution and syphilis and disease, whatever. There seem to be really there seems to be a rationale in Dix's mind for making him look the way he does. He never speaks about it. He never talks. He doesn't talk about anything. He says hardly anything.
Wow.
Which is the most horrible thing, which is the reason why when I'm writing about him, I look at the work from the point of view of reception, how they're received during the Weimar Republic, rather than trying to rely on Dix's intentions, which cannot be, you know, we can't pinpoint them. He doesn't talk about it, so we can't kind of decide, oh, this is what he meant, or that is what he meant, which is what a lot of books do on Dix. They try to tell you this is what he wanted to do, but you can't say that because he says so little. Yeah. So it is a very interesting question. I don't look at the women too directly. I'm really focused on the imagery of soldierhood, but it does come into play here and there as to why he seems to make the women look so grotesque. Well, this interest in grotesque with women more so than anything else. It is something that makes me quite uneasy at times when I'm working with the material, but. Yeah, I hope that answered the question. Look up Dry Viba and look up Girl in the Mirror. I think these are very interesting.
Right,
and
thank
if
you for
you want
those.
any material, I can send some material on if you would like that as well.
Great, thank you.
I think we've run out of time, and some of us have to teach.
It would be fantastic to keep it going.
Yeah, but I want to really thank you for participating, for coming here from around the world and New Jersey.